And Dan had covered these things. You may know he was in Dealey Plaza, and you may know that he was the only reporter who was allowed, as I understand it, to see the famed Zapruder film of Kennedy with the famed head snap. And supposedly, I mean, that what he reported was that the head went forward, and we later found it went back. How and why he interpreted it that way, something else. But the fact of the matter is that he believes that Family Secrets has new information, and it's interesting how figures of that power, when they're not anymore ensconced in the establishment, their eyes are opened and they become much more receptive to this. And I actually have heard from a former Secretary of Defense of the United States who said that Family Secrets blew him away, and he said, wow, you're really connecting the dots. And that's interesting to me that somebody at that level would feel that this was something, he didn't know these things. So the premise of Family of Secrets is that there's a completely different history out there, even about the subjects and the people we think we already know everything about. And one of the things we discovered when Family of Secrets came out was that we couldn't get people to read it. And do you know why? There was one refrain, and I'm sure you can guess what it all was. I'm sick of Bush, and I don't want to hear another word about him. I'm moving on, right? Well, how many countries, you know, Pinochet and Hitler and Mussolini or whatever, could people have said, and I'm not making an explicit comparison, but I'm saying where somebody fell out of favor for good reason, there was a rush to the exits. And of course, that's not what you should do. You know, when you discover that something goes terribly wrong with your family or your house, you don't say, I don't want to hear another word about it. You say, I better deal with this and see if the house itself is rotted at its foundations. I better figure this out before the whole bloody thing collapses. When you have a story about a big subject and you have almost nothing new, but a couple of little things they can tease, you're on all the shows. But if you go out there and you say, hey, folks, we missed everything, they go, gotta go, no time for you. Okay? And that's what happened with this book. Well, originally, I was told by the publisher that they had gotten word. I was supposed to. The Today Show was very interested in having me on, and NPR, some of you may listen to that, Morning Edition, wanted an exclusive, and on and on and on. And the New York Times wanted an advance review copy, specially requested under embargo and so forth. And total silence. Total silence. Total silence. And then when the reviews came out, there was one in the Los Angeles Times, a paper to which I've contributed, where the man basically began with a quote from Richard Hofstadter about the paranoid mind. And I believe he misrepresented Hofstadter anyway, and whatever you think or care about Hofstadter is another matter. But this was supposed to tell people, and he actually says in the review, whatever you do, do not read this book. And I actually saw online things where people said, you know, after reading that review, I think I won't read this book. And I would think if some guy you didn't know said, do not read this book, you, like a child, would do the exact opposite, right? Where's the cookie jar, you know? So this was amazing to me. And he actually said that I obviously was a nut because there was anybody who did not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone did not deserve a place at the table of civilized discourse. Well, I thought, well, that's interesting because like 80% of Americans don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And the House Select Committee on Assassinations, I mean, we know the House of Representatives is not really edgy. They concluded a probable conspiracy, though they couldn't figure out who was behind it. So this is what has happened, and this is the challenge, and this is one of the reasons that we're getting the word out in a kind of a guerrilla manner through the grassroots. Family of Secrets began when I started wondering in 2004 about what had happened to America. I won't go into this whole story, but I was living abroad. I was training investigative journalists in the former Yugoslavia. The run-up to the invasion of Iraq began. I could see, to my own satisfaction, that they were rushing this, that they had predetermined they wanted to do this, and that they were putting up evidence that supported something rather than having fairly considered whether this was the right course or was even necessary. And so as I lived in Europe, I noticed this sea change where people were having increasing animosity toward Americans, all Americans, and toward me. And I was used to, if you travel around the world generally, people love Americans because they've heard all those great things about this is the best country in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And so here was this tremendous animosity. And I thought, well, what had changed so much? And so I went back to the United States in early 2004, and I thought, how do people get in power? How did this guy, George W. Bush, I mean, let's face it, I mean, anybody in this room was probably better qualified to be president than he was. Okay. You know, and this is just from his own friends. And when I started working on this book and I would travel to people, they would all kind of chuckle. They thought this was the biggest joke imaginable. That their buddy and the ne'er-do-well, this and that, and there he, boy, wasn't that something. But, you know, they were used to that because they'd all, you know, gotten into the best schools through legacies and things like that, and they'd all gotten jobs through their wives or girlfriend's father, and they'd gotten tips, inside tips to trade stocks and make money, and, you know, everything came to them pretty easily, so this seemed like the normal course of democracy. And so I thought, well, gee, you know, I just wonder if there's anything more to this story of this country and where we've gotten to. And by the way, there was this thing called 9/11, which sort of kind of came and went, and it was this amazing, huge story, but there was no explanation for this thing, not a proper one. And then there was the invasion of Iraq, and there was no proper explanation for that because the reasons they gave clearly turned out to be false. So I thought, well, boy, I mean, everything turns out to be false. I mean, what's going on here? Who are these people? You know, are we in the Truman Show? Remember that movie where the guy discovers his whole life is a movie and everybody around him are hired actors and he's, you know, being manipulated for the show? You start wondering, you know, what is the reality here? And so I thought, you know, I'm just going to poke around in the bushes and see if there's anything with all those books that have been written that could possibly have been missed. And do you know what? You can take any subject, no matter how well covered it is, and you find out they didn't even begin to scratch the surface. So how and why did Bush become president and do what he did? Well, what did he do? I mean, the moment he was in office, he began doing all these strange things. This is before 9/11. He began doing things that are typical of a police state. And I wrote pieces for The Nation magazine and other places, Slate and so forth, about all these curious things and lockdowns of records and prior presidential records and trying to prevent the Freedom of Information Act from operating properly. These were all the kind of things you would expect, again, from a Pinochet, not from the President of the United States. So I thought, well, this is weird. These are sort of police state tendencies. And then there were these corporatist influences where they suddenly had this idea that the job of the EPA was to hire everybody from every chemical company in America and cancel all the laws. And again, I mean, if any of you have read, for example, Naomi Klein's excellent Shock Doctrine, where she talks about that this is deliberate. This is a philosophy that is actually acknowledged that the only way they can get what they want to create shocks, tremendous shocks to the system that are so traumatizing and convulsive that anything can be instituted right after that. And of course, you know what happened after 9/11. Constant those alerts. Remember those alerts? And they always came right before an election, and they were never about anything. People in the FBI complained and said, these are not even legitimate. We don't want to put these things out. I remember living in New York City. They used to, I don't know if they do it anymore, you suddenly would see a ton of police cars just, you know, going in a convoy. Have you heard about that? It turns out that is an exercise to shock. They want people to pay attention, and so they practice these things, and it's not clear what that's for, but it just terrifies everybody. So I thought, well, this is just very interesting, and so I began looking at the Bush family, and I started looking at W, and I said, how does a guy like him become president? And how and why did huge amounts of money from supposedly the smartest people in this country bet on this particular guy instead of, let's say, you know, a kind of a Bob Dole-ish type figure who's at least an intelligent and accomplished guy, whether you agree with him or not? Why this particular person? And the more I looked at W, the more I saw that there was some sense of him as something, part of something larger, a kind of a continuity, if you will, that he represented an ongoing mission. It wasn't so much that anybody really liked him personally. And moreover, as I looked at him, I saw that there were all these things about his past that were so problematical that if they ever came out, he never could have been elected in 2000, and he certainly never would have been reelected in 2004. One of those you know about was his military service. I mean, he just took off. He just stopped serving in the military during a war. Now, you would think a man who was president of the United States who then started a war that turned out to be under false pretenses, if you learned in the middle of that war that he himself had skipped out of another war and lied about it, that would maybe be a good story. Silly me, that maybe the media, you know, they did for like a month. for a month, to be fair, and I go into this chapter and verse in Family of Secrets. For about a month, national media tried, somewhat flaccidly, but they tried to kind of look into this stuff. And the White House just ran circles around them. They were just much cleverer about it, and they stopped them. And then you had the Swift Boat Veterans for the Truth, whose website was put up by this guy who worked for Karl Rove, who later died in a plane crash, and, you know, on and on and on. I mean, a lot of effort goes into psychological operations. And you talk to anybody who's at any high level in the military, in intelligence, and frankly, in any institution, any corporation or anything, psychological operations are crucial. In other words, you want, when you work for a big bank, you want to figure out how to convince people that the bank really cares about you. Well, we know the bank doesn't care about them at all, but yet that's what they tell them. That's psychological operations. And so psychological operations are an important part of what goes on in our country in the power process, and it's something we don't cover. We don't talk about that. I usually talk about, well, just briefly to touch on the revelations, the more I looked at George W., the more I saw there had been a cover-up of his military service, that a decision had been made that if this comes out, his career is ruined, and not just his career, but probably his family, and his family was now, it was the third or fourth generation that was a political dynasty. And then I found the fingerprints of his father, and that his father seemed to, I wondered why the father, you know, who was already a major figure in Washington, did he not know during a war that his son had just taken off? I mean, did he not ask him when they got together, as they often did? And so I began looking at the father, and I discovered that the father seemed like he did know, and the father seemed like he had somehow helped cover up this thing. And then I thought, well, that's very interesting, because I thought the father and the son hated each other. You remember that? That's what everybody thinks. The father and the son, and in the last few years, everybody says, gee, you know, I sure miss H.W. That's what everybody thinks. The father and the son, and in the last few years, everybody says, gee, you know, I sure miss H.W. I sure miss the father. What a much more reasonable man he was. He went into Iraq, but he stopped. You know, he gave stuff away to the corporations, but he stopped. You know, he did this, but he stopped, you know. And so I thought, boy, you know, I'm not seeing signs of a real rift between the two of them, just a stylistic difference. And so the more I looked into it, I thought, you know, I've got to look at the father. And so more than half of Family of Secrets is about George H.W. Bush, a man we knew nothing about. So a couple more things. First of all, I said I would talk a little bit about Obama. There's an article we're handing out here at the first table as you go out the door on your left. It's called What Obama is Up Against. It's not intended to take sides there. It is intended to say you cannot view presidents as sole figures, great actors on the stage of history, elected, and now they do whatever they want, and if they don't do it, they're bad. Presidents are constantly terrified, because just as they can't get in without huge numbers of very, very powerful people saying okay, they can't stay in unless huge numbers of powerful people say okay. And we've seen many presidents, bad things happen to them. Jimmy Carter, peaceably, it was kept to one term. Bill Clinton had a sexual scandal. You could say, well, that was his own doing, but why was that such a big story? And why was $100 million spent on prosecuting that? I mean, this is not normal. Somebody, what did they spend on the 9/11 Commission? What was it, 17 million? First it was with 3. Okay, so you get your numbers comparison there. I'm very happy to say that Family of Secrets is selling steadily, and the word is getting out there. But, you know, the question, people always say, what can I do? Well, whatever it is, whether it's Family of Secrets or it's Naomi Klein's book or it's books that people here have written, something that my friend Cindy Sheehan wrote, you want to get it out there. You want to let people know about it, Colleen Rowley and so forth. Spread the word. When we have the staff and resources, we will consider a broad array of subjects, and one thing I will commit to doing is that if and when we can settle on a particular and distinct aspect of unanswered questions regarding what happened on September 11, 2001, we will explore that. And whatever we find, we will report.